Trigger warning. This video discusses sensitive topics about sex trafficking, medical sexual violence, abuse, and exploitation that some viewers may find disturbing. This is the slavery era in America, a time when rape was legal. Sex, power, and violence were part of everyday life. The system was designed to keep the slaves without power, without knowledge, and without even the slightest hope for change. The only thing white America cared about was how the slaver could maximize their profit. Some people will tell you that black men weren't tortured that much, because as property, it was in the master's best interest to avoid damaging their property. But that couldn't be further from the truth. The whole concept of torture came about because there were no consequences. Anyone could do whatever they wanted with their property. Just take a look at the tools they used to torture these people. Chained by the neck, like some kind of animal. Fastened with a head frame and a mouthpiece to prevent him from eating. And iron weights to make sure he wouldn't run away. Life expectancy for a black American slave born into slavery was just 21 or 22 years, compared to whites 40 to 43 years. About 50% of enslaved babies died in the first year of their life. That was twice the death rate of white babies. Those who survived were trained to be completely dependent on their master. This was the only way to keep them from running or revolting. Sexual abuse was a big part of slavery, just as much as it was for women as it was for men. For men, though, it was a different kind of torture. Lewis Clark, a former slave, once said that a slave can't be a man because he could not protect his female kin from being sexually assaulted by owners and overseers. He had to sacrifice his mother, sister, wife, and daughter. He had no other choice but to turn a blind eye. The sexual abuse of black men and boys is heavily recorded throughout history, but it is rarely talked about. That's because there were no limits to the depravity of humankind. White women also sexually assaulted their male slaves. When slavery was at its peak, white women received their own slaves. This was a common practice. White parents often gave their daughters more enslaved people than land. This gave the woman some form of independence. During this period, women were supposed to be obedient and faithful to their husbands. Unfortunately, many of them were abused. They were also fully aware that their husbands were sexually abusing their slaves. So the women wanted power of their own. They too could make money selling slaves, hence the breeding farms. It's time for us to unlearn all the BS they taught us and learn who we truly are. That's exactly why we made our bundle called Unlock Minds. It includes multiple ebooks breaking down our real history, some traps that keep us stuck in the system, and how we can build real wealth and power. Schools will never teach us this. It's up to us. The best part is we're not going to charge hundreds or thousands of dollars for you to access this type of information like most online gurus do. You can get the complete bundle for only $1 by clicking the first link in our description. Thank you for the support. Now, let's get back into it. Number 1. Breeding farms. It was very easy for someone who was a livestock seller to turn into a slave trader. These people had a very dark mindset. Slave breeding was an entire industry. Some states, especially Virginia, relied on slaves as their main source of income. The price of slaves varied based on the industry that invested in slaves for the production of sugar, rice, cotton, and tobacco. Because of the constant territorial expansion, a lot of white families needed more slaves. As long as the need for enslaved labor was going strong, slave breeders could literally make a fortune by forcing slaves to reproduce. White women would pick strong and healthy enslaved black men either for their own personal satisfaction or to force them to have sex with women and get them pregnant. These white women didn't care if the enslaved man had to sleep with his sister, mother, or daughter. If he fits the profile, then he would make an excellent breeder. White women preferred young and able farm men. An excellent physique provided a better bargain. These men were forced to produce more and more children so their masters could sell them at a high price. If the man resisted, he would either be severely punished or killed. Here is how the industry worked. A 1662 law known as Partus Sequitur Ventrum stated that if an enslaved mother gave birth to a child, that child would inherit the status of a slave. If the mother was free, then her child would also be born free. Reproducing was critical when white supremacists wanted to increase the number of slaves they had. More slaves meant more labor, more money, and money equals power. This became a crucial practice, especially after 1808 when the international slave trade was banned. White people had to use any means necessary to maintain a high number of slaves without the transatlantic slave trade. So, men sexually assaulted black women to procreate, while white women often forced their slaves to increase their numbers. The children would be sold on the market as valuable commodities or raised on farms and plantations as laborers. In many cases, white women would take these kids away from their parents and bring them into the big house. The children would be made to serve. If they wanted to sell these children, then they would create this feeding regimen and control everything the children ate. If the children were seen as valuable stock, then the white woman would give them medicine like Jerusalem oak. This product was used to treat parasites like worms. If the child was not fit enough, then white women would force them to run around the farms and race with other black children. This was a test to see who would be the fittest. This practice ensured that the children would fit the criteria for extended labor and sell for a good price. Many of the young boys were also kept in the breeding farms and forced to reproduce, just as their fathers and mothers were forced before them. In some cases, white women would make black women and men watch their children go through the same traumatic ordeal. This created generational trauma. It is very hard to figure out exactly how valuable these enslaved people were, but here are some rough estimates. In 1860, the total value of enslaved people in America was $4 billion. This was much higher than the total value of all the gold and silver in the country, which was $228.3 million. It was more valuable than all the money in circulation priced at $435.4 million, and even all the farmland in the South worth $1.92 billion. To slave owners, enslaved people were the most valuable asset, worth more than all these other things combined. Southern slave owners would take out loans using their enslaved people as collateral. Banks would then turn these loans into bonds and sell them to investors worldwide, even in places where slavery was illegal. Wealthy plantation owners would start new banks in states like Louisiana and Mississippi. They would write down a list of slaves that planters could mortgage. This allowed them to buy more enslaved people and expand their cotton farms. To fund these loans, the banks sold the bonds to other rich people in New York, London, Paris, and Amsterdam. The investors didn't technically own the slaves. They owned the bonds that were backed by the value of these slaves. In modern finance, this process is called securitization. It was the perfect ploy to make more money. Without slavery, America wouldn't have become the global powerhouse it is today. America was pretty much built on slavery. It is what helped modernize and revolutionize the U.S. in the 18th and 19th centuries. It catapulted the U.S. into one of the best capitalist, industrial, and modern economies. In just one lifetime, the South went from this tiny coastal strip of worn-out tobacco fields to this massive cotton empire. By 1861, the South had 5 times more enslaved people than it did during the American Revolution. It was producing 2 billion pounds of cotton each year. This allowed the United States to dominate cotton production, which was essential for the Industrial Revolution. The only nation that was making more cotton than the US was England. Number 2, sexual exploitation for personal satisfaction. As was already mentioned, many white women used black men because their husbands couldn't satisfy them. They sexually abused male slaves. In some of these cases, rich women who inherited a lot of slaves did not need to marry. Their male slaves would satisfy their needs. According to an interview by an unnamed former slave in Georgia from 1937, it was common for white women to sleep with black men. Here is an excerpt from that interview. In them times, white men went with colored gals and women boldly. Anytime they saw one and wanted her, she had to go with him, and his wife didn't say nothing about it. Not only the men, but the women went with colored men too. That's why so many women slave owners wouldn't marry, because they was going with one of their slaves. These things that's going on now ain't new. They've been happening. That's why I say you just as well leave them alone, because they going to do what they want to anyhow. According to Harriet Jacobs, a writer whose autobiography exposed many of the untold horrors of sexual abuse, there was a white woman who preyed on enslaved black men. She would pick the most brutalized young man who would never dare to cross her. These anecdotes made it clear that some white women initiated these sexual acts even though they clearly knew their cultural role. They did it anyway and chose the most broken and traumatized men to hide the abuse. Jacobs explained, she did not make advances to her father's more intelligent servants. Instead, she specifically singled out a man over whom her authority could be exercised with less fear of exposure. Such a man had to be previously terrorized into submission. The woman would then abuse his state of mind. If he refused, then he would be punished. The slave owners, masters, and overseers called themselves Christian, yet allowed this debauchery to happen. Of course, not every white woman was brave enough to avoid getting married and keep using slaves. Some women in the South sexually abused their male slaves in secret. This allowed them to explore their sexual desires while still appearing innocent and virtuous to the outside world. By keeping these relationships hidden, they maintained their reputation for being pure and modest. Based on testimony by a man named Hinton, a white doctor once told him that in Missouri and Virginia, white women, especially the daughters of those smaller planters who were brought into more direct relations with the Negro, had compelled someone of the men to have something to do with them. These women knew that their brothers, fathers, and grandfathers were sexually abusing their female slaves, so they saw it as another form of release. Remember, these people were raised in homes that made abuse just an everyday life kind of thing, so most women didn't see anything wrong with that. If the black man who was abused by their white mistress was already married to another slave, then this could have caused a lot of tension between the couples. Not only that, but it would result in the birth of mixed-race babies. There was one such case in antebellum Alabama, where a white man filed for divorce because his wife gave birth to a black child. The father of the child was one of her black slaves. But what happened if a black man was caught sleeping with his female master? In 19th century Virginia and the rest of the southern states that allowed slavery, the rape of a white woman by a slave was a crime punishable by death. However, if a slave was found guilty of attempting to rape a white woman in Virginia, they were not sentenced to death. Instead, they were sexually mutilated. Number 3. Castration and other forms of punishment. Castration was another form of punishment. This was used if an enslaved man was caught in bed with his master's daughter or anyone from the family, even if he had an affair with an enslaved woman that his slave master was interested in. Not only was the punishment used to take away any form of pride that the man had, but also as a way to showcase power and superiority. By feminizing black men, slave owners reassured themselves that they were the most masculine men on their properties. They also demonstrated this by sexually abusing women and girls. Back then, the laws were much more severe for black people. White men faced no repercussions, but how the accused slave was treated depended not only on the race of the accuser, but also on their behavior as well. Many white supremacists, like aristocrats and wealthy merchants, used enslaved men as a form of sexual entertainment. Women and men would force the enslaved to take their clothes off, line up, and have their naked bodies ridiculed and scrutinized in a room full of people. There were other forms of punishment as well. Enslaved black men and women were constantly afraid of being sold, especially if they lived somewhere in the North. Their masters would threaten to sell them to the southern states and the West Indies, where conditions were extremely brutal and there was a high death rate. If these enslaved people already had a family there, this punishment sounded particularly terrifying. Female slave masters also punished the black slaves with nakedness. One former slave said that his mistress stripped and whipped him. He said, "Mr. Hammonds was a very severe and cruel master, and his wife still worse. She used to tie me up and flog me while naked." Another black man described his mistress in a similar manner. She too had stripped him and beat him. He said, "His wife was a harsh, cruel, hard-hearted, tyrannical woman. Her whole being was filled with hatred of the blackest and bitterest kind against the poor, downtrodden, crushed, despised, and trampled slave. She seemed possessed with some satanic influence and never was in her glory unless she could have her slaves tied up to the whipping post, stripped naked with a pair of flat irons fastened to their feet. Then she would stand by, drawing the lash like an infuriated demon. All the nicer sensibilities of her womanly nature seemed to be crushed out of existence. She would ply the lash until the poor victim would faint dead away. When there wasn't any beating involved, the mistress could humiliate and feminize enslaved men. She could make black boys and men wear dress-like shirts. Young black men and boys were denied the right to wear pants, especially in the Deep South. There were plenty of interviews and historical records to back that up. It goes back to the idea that men are superior to women. Boys and girls were taught from an early age how to dress, act, and behave. And for boys to wear long, dress-like shirts made them look weak. White women were encouraged to be with strong men, but discouraged from being with someone who looks weak. There are many letters and diaries that mention the highly sexualized nature of black enslaved men. Many of their masters and mistresses had some kind of psychosexual superiority complex. Here is a record of Richard Orford, who was enslaved in Georgia as a young boy. He said, "The children wore a one-piece garment, not unlike a slightly lengthened dress. This was kept in place by a string tied around their waists." Another person from Georgia recalled a similar memory, stating, "The one little cotton shirt that was all children wore in summertime then weren't worth talking about. They called it a shirt, but it looked more like a long-tailed nightgown to me. This is something they wore every day and every night, mainly in summer. When winter came, some boys finally got to wear pants, but only in the coldest parts of winter. The shirts were warmer and the pants quilted. This provided a bit more coverage, but it still was not enough to keep the body warm. In some places, the black boys wore shoes and a small coat, but neither of them had underwear or drawers. Some slaves didn't even get to wear pants. Even if it was freezing outside, they would wear the same things over and over again until they were worn thin and shrunk up. But it didn't matter. If their masters didn't give them a new pair of clothes, then the men would be stuck wearing what little they had for days on end. This was probably the most psychologically damning aspect. You see, when boys become young men, it is normal for them to try and pursue women. But in the mid-19th century, boys matured very early. Most of them were sexually active and drinking alcohol when they were teenagers. Some girls were married off as soon as they got their period. By choosing to dress the boys more feminine, slaveholders established their masculinity. They wanted to make sure that young black men would have less of a chance of courting young girls. Some boys didn't get to wear pants until they were 10 or 12 years old. Others would receive their first pants when they were 14 years old. It really depended on their master or mistress. But there are even more disturbing horrors than that. Events that white women also witnessed and probably even abetted. Ever heard of buck breaking? Number 4. Buck breaking. This is probably one of the worst forms of punishment ever inflicted on black enslaved men. It may not have been the most painful form of punishment, but it was definitely devastating on a psychological level. In 18th and 19th century America, buck breaking was used to punish black men when whips and beatings were not enough. The men tried to rebel in some way, so the slave owner had to use other means of control to dominate the black men. In the Caribbean, another form of sexual abuse was used to publicly humiliate, degrade, and dehumanize male slaves. Slave masters and other white supremacists would gather around to sexually abuse male slaves in front of everyone. This was a common practice when slave rebellions became more prominent. First, an enslaved black man was to be stripped naked and beaten in front of the entire village or town. Then white men would take turns sexually abusing the man. This was also done in front of their wives and children. Their sons, daughters, brothers, and sisters were made to watch. This act of sodomy was a warning to other slaves not to dare cross a white supremacist. It was used as a means to make the black person feel less of a man, a calculated approach to destroy the self-respect, self-esteem, and will of a black man. These men were stripped of their power, their rights, and their dignity. Then there is the shaming, not only from the rapists, but the entire community. This form of torture was done to terrify and humiliate a black man beyond what any of us could possibly imagine. It caused permanent damage to their psyche and parts of their brain. Many enslaved men couldn't live with the trauma afterward. Some ran away never to return again. Others committed suicide. Well, the forced reproduction, constant terror, and mutilation would be their downfall. The more and more black people came into the world, the harder it was to control them. Eventually, their numbers got so big and the rebellion so problematic that politicians had to make a change. But change took a long time. In 1862, the government abolished slavery in Washington, D.C. To keep local slave owners loyal to the Union, Abraham Lincoln's administration offered to pay them $300 for each enslaved person they owned. They paid 979 owners for a total of 2,989 enslaved people. This is how Washington became the island of freedom. Everywhere else, it was a different story. Washington was surrounded by the slave states of Maryland and Virginia. Lincoln made a similar offer to the border states, but Delaware rejected it and the offer was never made again. In 1865, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery nationwide, causing all other slave owners to lose their enslaved people without compensation. The abolition of slavery impacted plantations the most, and because of the war, the country suffered. You see, during the Civil War, the South got a taste of black power. The idea that black people could unite and turn into this armed force terrified them. That's why atrocities were so common, and so repression and terror started again. Many Southern landowners moved west to find new opportunities. However, the reversal of Reconstruction over the next decade led to farm workers in the South still working for very low pay. Despite these challenges, the country recovered. It even grew stronger. That's because after slavery was abolished, the black codes were put in place. They were there to stop black people from getting their power back, and for a time, the black codes were widely successful. These rules were meant to establish white supremacy in the South. They were used not only to limit the freedom of black people, but to make sure that they were going to be used and abused as cheap labor. In the days of segregation, life was still miserable. Number 5, Jim Crow terror. The myth of the black rapist and the supposed need to protect white women was the backbone of segregation. Freed black men were now a threat not just to their mistress, but the entire social order. Back then, women were seen as these helpless creatures in need of saving. They were pure and respectable people. All they had to do was get married, stay at home, and take care of their children. White supremacists used the Bible to justify forming and using Jim Crow laws. Theologians and ministers taught white people that they were the chosen ones and that black people were cursed to serve. It was not their place to meddle with the pure white woman. So the common folk went on to say that whites were superior and black people were inferior. They had to remain separated from white folks at all costs, because white people were the true children of God. The way the United States was set up was that even the poorest, lowest, and least educated white person was still higher in society than any black person could ever be. Add the Ku Klux Klan to the mix, and you get the perfect form of terror on a scale so big it would shape the entire country. When someone wanted to lynch or beat a black man, they could just falsely accuse him of raping a white woman. It was that easy. But what many people don't know is that women also led the Ku Klux Klan. First came suffrage, then came the women of the KKK. They were master manipulators with immense social power. The Women's KKK. This was an affiliated but separate organization of white Protestant women. This is how it all started. The first KKK was founded in Pulaski, Tennessee, after the Civil War. White men were furious that black people could vote. Not only did the war bring the South to financial ruin, but it also shattered an entire slavery system that made the South rich in the first place. So the KKK would organize rituals in secret and make sure that the Reconstruction would never give the black people true freedom and equality. Women were not direct members of the Klan, but they did help around. Some made the famous white robe for their husbands and family members and helped with the rituals and other social activities. Women had this symbolic role. They were these angelic beings to be protected from the black demons that have overwhelmed the countryside. The first Klan ended by the 1870s, but the second Klan was yet to come. It started in 1915 after an anti-Semitic lynching in Atlanta and a cross burning on Stone Mountain. This new Klan was big in the 1920s. It attracted 3 to 6 million Americans. Unlike the first one, which did all its ceremonies in secret, this one was out in the open. They were even connected to the government. It was everywhere. Legals, also known as paid organizers, would go from place to place and talk to the people. If the people saw the black community as a problem, then the Klan would plant seeds of hatred and fear that would inspire the whites to join. They also had to pay a fee to join. Eventually, the KKK became so powerful that a lot of women wanted to make their own separate but affiliated organization, and it worked. It was quite similar to the male KKK. It had a hierarchy that was very close to the Roman Catholic Church. They had leaders like the Imperial Commander, Claylifts, Clocards, Clygraps, Claybees, and the Klexter Clerigos. They were there to enforce the Klan rules, collect money, recruit members, and organize events. The only difference is that the women's KKK didn't do the lynchings. They were manipulators and used their social power to spread their agendas. These women were in charge of whisper networks, also called poison squads. If there was any white person, Catholic or Jewish, who was against a political candidate of the KKK, the women would destroy their reputation. They boycotted people's businesses, destroyed school teachers, and advocated for pro-KKK candidates. They would use donations, speeches, and parades to flaunt their influence and then force other white women and men to accept the values and teachings of the KKK or face the consequences. The women didn't just lead the WKKK. They were also active outside it. Lulu Markwell, for example, was the first head of the WKKK. She was also active in the women's suffrage movement. Daisy Douglas Barr, who led the WKKK in Indiana and 7 other states, was a Quaker preacher. She was also the first female vice chair of the Republican State Committee and was involved in temperance and women's groups. As you can see, many white women did everything they possibly could to make the lives of black men a living hell. First, the men would be beaten with paddles, whips, and other instruments that inflict maximum damage and leave permanent scars, sometimes to the point of a life-threatening injury. Others were branded and mutilated. This terror lasted for decades. This documentary was truly heartbreaking to make, but the truth needed to be told. All we ask is that you drop a like and subscribe to the channel to help our movement get spread to more people. If you'd like to learn some more Black history they never taught us in school, click the video on the screen. We'll see you over there.